are so thrilled to have you here today in our new office and for our conservation chat tonight about restoring lost landscapes, or also known as the Catawba Grasslands Project. I have to thank a few sponsors for making this possible: Duke Energy and Piedmont Natural Gas for sponsoring our conservation chats. And then also the Catawba Grasslands Project, which is supported by Wells Fargo and Crescent Community. So special thanks to them for making some of this work possible. And I want to introduce you to my colleagues, who are the ones who are leading this ambitious habitat restoration initiative. Sean Bloom, who is our GIS director and biologist. Will Ruark, I fumble on his last name, our conservation preserve manager. And Sean, just as a little bio, graduated from Catawba College with degrees in environmental science and biology. He joined CLC in 2011. Before that, he was a park ranger at Boone's Cave Park in Lexington, and he also was a staff scientist at Hart and Hickman, which is an environmental engineering firm. Will, prior to joining Catawba Lands Conservancy, he worked for North Carolina State Parks as a ranger at both Clear Lake State Park and Lake Norman Lake Norman State Park, I know that one. He is very passionate about fire management. He holds lots of certificates in prescribed burning and wildlife fire suppression, so he will tell you a lot about that. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I see a lot of new faces here, so indulge me for just a moment. If any of you are new or were invited by friends, to let you know who we are, the Catawba Lands Conservancy. We're your local nonprofit here in the Charlotte region, and we work to conserve land across the southern Piedmont. And we do that primarily in two ways. One is through a conservation easement, where a private landowner maintains ownership of their property, but they promise to, or they accept certain restrictions on that property, and it's our job to make sure that those restrictions are adhered to. And those restrictions stay with the land. So if they sell the property, deed it to their children, or change ownership, those restrictions stay in place. And the other way we protect land is to actually own and manage that land. That's what we're going to talk about primarily tonight. We've protected over 17,000 acres in the Charlotte region. Of that, we own and manage about 5,000 of those acres. So what we're going to talk about tonight are grasslands. Now, some of you, or many of you like me, may have thought that the Piedmont should have looked much more like this. Rolling hills of lush forests and trees everywhere. And I assume that this is what the Piedmont looked like myself. Just covered with forests of towering oak trees and hickory trees, and miles in all directions. And there's even this legend that a squirrel could go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and never touch the ground. Has anyone heard this legend before? It sounds like they have. Okay. Well, then it may surprise you to find out that, in fact, the Piedmont was actually a patchwork of forested river bottoms and slopes and grassy hilltops and ridge tops. And some of you may even be familiar with some other types of grasslands that are known to the Carolinas. Salt marshes out on our coast. The sandhills and the longleaf pine savannas. And even in our high elevation mountains, the heath balds and grassy balds on some of our mountaintops. But the Piedmont had their grasslands too, such as Piedmont prairies, open Piedmont savannas, pine oak savannas, and even grassy woodlands. Now, Piedmont prairies were once common across the flat ridge tops and hilltops of the Piedmont. And these areas would have been covered in grasses and wildflowers. And there have been few trees, just like here you can see, there's just a few trees dotting this landscape, very few shrubs as well. Another common landscape would have been the pine oak savannas. And these areas would have had more trees, but the forest floor still would have been covered with grasses and wildflowers. And in fact, the Lord proprietors, North Carolina was divided up among 8 lord proprietors, and the Surveyor General, John Lawson, he explored the Carolinas for them. And he wrote in 1709 that we traveled this day about 25 miles over pleasant savanna ground, high and dry, having few trees upon it, and those standing at a great distance. And he wrote that as he was actually traveling in the Charlotte region of the Carolinas. Now, this photo here is a little bit overstocked with trees, and we'll talk about this a little bit later tonight. This is a place that we're actually working to restore one of these pine oak savannas over the Spencer Mountain Conservation Area. Now, woodland grasslands, also, this is an area that would still had even more trees, but the canopy would not have been closed, so you would still have light reaching the forest floor, which would have supported the growth, again, of grasses and wildflowers. This habitat type is more common around monadnocks, and that's a term that refers to small isolated mountains that are rising from gently sloping or virtually level terrain. Think Spencer Mountain, Crowder's Mountain, Pilot Mountain, the Uwaris. Those would have been monadnocks, and those would have had much more of this woodland grassland habitat. And an even more rare natural community are granitic flat rocks. And we are actually working to try to protect 2 of these granitic flat rocks here in the Charlotte area. They're extremely rare habitats. They're much more common down in Georgia and parts of South Carolina. If anyone here is familiar with 40-acre rock in Kershaw, South Carolina, that would be one of these granitic flat rocks. But we're working to try to protect 2 of them right here in the Charlotte area. Just don't take my word for it. There's a historic record for these grasslands. This is a map from 1672. And you can see what would have been the Appalachian Mountains along the left there. And just below it is written Savannah. Again, going back to John Lawson, in his book, New Voyage of the Carolinas, he included a map. And you can see that he depicts the Carolinas as forested, but those trees are spaced pretty far apart, indicating a savanna habitat. And in fact, you can see here, along what he's identified as the Santee River, he's written Savannah. This map from 1718, again, in the Carolinas, identifies the Grand Savannah. There's map after map, writings after writings, of folks identifying the Piedmont having a Grand Savannah. And even our rivers and creeks point to the existence of grasslands dominated by river cane. We've got Cane Creek down in Union County, but also references to buffalo and elk. And that's not by accident. The first Europeans didn't come into this region and say, I'm going to name a creek after an animal I haven't seen. Dutch Buffalo Creek would have been a Dutch settlement where the buffalo were coming across the creek. Irish Buffalo Creek is an Irish settlement where buffalo were coming to the creeks. Elk Shoals, Buffalo Creek Shoals, Grassy Branch, these would have been creeks that would have been covered with cane brakes rather than large forested trees. So our grasslands were maintained by grazing buffalo and elk. In fact, if you go up to the Blue Ridge Parkway, there's even a marker identifying the last known location of buffalo being seen in North Carolina from 1799. Fire was also important in maintaining these grasslands. These fires would have either been started by lightning strikes, and then allowed to run across the landscape because we didn't suppress fires at the time. They would have also been started by the indigenous people of the time, who were maintaining these grasslands to support the buffalo and the elk, which were a food source. So this is an elk here, and you can see that their range included parts of the Carolinas as late as the 1780s. And also the American bison, whose historic range absolutely included the Charlotte region until they were hunted out. So what's happened to our grasslands? We've lost about 90% of our southeastern grasslands. Some of the reasons for that, again, is going to be fire suppression, because Europeans came in, we got scared of fire. Fire started to burn up our crops. It would burn up our log cabins. It burned up the forest that we were maintaining. These grasslands were also lost to farmland conversion. A lot of them were up in high, dry areas with very rich soils, excellent for farming. And highways. Some of our first highways and wagon roads would have been right through the middle of these grasslands. Again, high, dry, and flat makes excellent places to build farms, build towns, build highways, and then ultimately urban sprawl. Again, as highways were built, cities built up, and urban sprawl took place. And nowadays, most of our grasslands are primarily isolated to utility corridors, roadside right-of-ways, and even as small as just around power poles where broadcast brain can't reach them. The late conservationist and biologist E.O. Wilson, he wrote that the southeastern grasslands were probably the richest terrestrial biome in all of North America. But sadly, many of our rare species of plants and animals, pollinating insects and birds, thrived and depended on those grasslands. North Carolina has 560 native bees, over 2,000 native moths and butterflies, and even flies are pollinating insects for us. These grasslands are critical for many of our pollinating insects, which in turn support so much of our state's agriculture. Apples, blueberries, peaches, all fruits that we love all depend on pollinating insects. And when I talk about bees, I'm not just talking about yellow jackets and hornets and wasps. I'm talking about bumblebees, which I've taught my daughter you can pet. Has anyone ever petted a bumblebee? You can pet bumblebees. It's very fun. But also little tiny sweat bees. And this little bee here on the tip of a finger, that's a cuckoo leafcutter, the smallest bee in North America. Our butterflies include luna moths, monarch butterflies, swallowtails. And I mentioned flies being pollinating insects. Who here has had a pawpaw? Okay? If you haven't had a pawpaw, it's this great fruit. It's a tropical fruit that grows here in North Carolina. It tastes like a mix between a mango and a banana. They're pollinated by flies. Flies are important pollinators for us. Unfortunately, many of these insects rely on grasslands. Many of our native bees actually nest underground, so they need exposed soil, which you find in grasslands. Or they'll actually nest or lay eggs within old stems of flowering plants. But unfortunately, our pollinating insects are in serious trouble. The rusty patch bumblebee was once found across the Northeast and even extended into North Carolina. But in 2017, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to declare it as endangered. Monarch butterflies, with their impressive migratory story, where butterflies will migrate, lay eggs, those eggs will pupate, become butterflies and go up north. And then the Great Migration, the adult butterfly very north, will make that flight all the way down to Mexico. But we've seen a decline of monarch butterflies. We've lost 84% of them since 1996. Now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approved what they call a candidate conservation agreement. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's what they call them. To try to address the decline of monarch butterflies. And that was in 2015. You can see from the chart here, this is where 2015 is. So it's working. We have seen some recovery, but it's still not enough, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And that management agreement applied to utility corridors and planting milkweed on those utility corridors, power line easements and such, or power line right-of-ways and such. Just remember that everything is connected in a food web. And so as insects decline, so do the birds that rely on them. And we've lost millions of our grassland birds and seen major declines in some of our most iconic grassland birds. The American kestrel, which is the smallest raptor in North America, it's a raptor that's about this size. Small but beautiful. The loggerhead shrike has declined 79% across its range. Now, for those of you who don't know this bird, its nickname is the butcher bird. It's a bird that is a very aggressive hunter, but it often catches more than it can eat. And so what it will do is it will save its food, like a good little bird should. And it will impale it on thorns of black locusts and such, and come back for it later. That's where it gets its other name. And today, you don't hear the call of the bobwhite quail anymore. Unless you're in our room. Our grasslands are also important for botanical diversity. This is where the story of the Catawba Grasslands Project starts. In 1995, long before the Catawba Grasslands Project was even considered, CLC protected its first property, the Catawba Wildflower Glen, which included populations of the Georgia aster, which is a rare plant that only grows in Piedmont prairies. Fast forward to 2015, when Andy Kane, who's not here tonight, he's a member of our stewardship team, and he found this plant here, the spotted bee balm, at Pinhook Preserve, which ultimately launched the Catawba Grasslands Project. So the Catawba Grasslands Project is an initiative to enhance, restore, and create our historic grasslands across the southern Piedmont through the use of good fire and other management techniques. And this project currently encompasses about 145 acres over 10 different projects. And I'd like to bring Will up to talk about the management tools that we do use for this work. Thank you, Will.
Thank you. Awesome. Now, Sean has talked about all the sad news about the grasslands. Let's talk about how CLC is working to reestablish them and to restore them. So there are several techniques that we use. I'm going to refer to them as management tools, and we're going to use those to enhance, restore, and to create these grasslands. These management tools are going to be mimicking the two things that Sean mentioned earlier. We're going to attempt to mimic what a large grazing herbivore would have done, so our bison and our elk, and then we're going to also try to start using fire again, good fire again. You might hear me interchange my use of the words management tools with disturbance, because we are trying to cause a disturbance in the ecosystem that'll benefit in the end. I recently heard one of the foremost southeastern fire ecologists. His name is Cecil Frost. He was a professor at UNC. He actually referred to fire not being the disturbance, but lack of fire is actually the disturbance. So the three management techniques that we're going to be using to restore these areas are going to be the use of a bush hog, understory thinning, and then our favorite, you're going to find out it's my favorite, prescribed fire. All right, so bush hogging. Why are we bush hogging? For those that aren't familiar with a bush hog, that is going to be a large mower on the back of a tractor. It chops things up very roughly. It's not going to be like a finishing mower like we would use to cut our front yard. It's more blunt. It can cut down small trees, bushes, and grass, and it leaves behind a mulched area. So what is the largest mammal that we have roaming the Piedmont right now, and that is here all the time? Because we're not going to say bear. A bear might be here every once in a while.
Deer.
Oh, you said cows. That's the largest mammal. You're right. It is going to be the deer. It's going to be the white-tailed deer. This is a good photo from one of our game cameras up at the Buffalo Creek Preserve up in Cabarrus County. That is a beautiful 10-point buck. On average, male deer get up to be about 150 pounds. And how can that compare to these two animals? The bison, a male bison was up to 2,000 pounds. And the male elk was up to 1,000 pounds. So deer, they're not grazing animals. They forage, they browse, they nip at different things. If you have deer in your neighborhood, they probably have ate your hostas at some point. So they really like to eat specific parts of specific plants that have high nutrient contents. And that's not grazing, so they're not causing a disturbance that we really truly need. They only cause a disturbance whenever they go unmanaged and there's nothing else for them to eat. They might start eating some of our special plants that we don't want them to eat, like our Schweinet sunflower. But so something of this large stature can work its way through a forest and knock down trees and keep things open. That huge head on that bison was able to keep our forest floor open and continue to graze for 9 to 11 hours a day. So you have to eat a lot of grass to feed a 2,000-pound bison. So how are we going to try to mimic it? One of the only ways we can try to mimic it right now is using a bush hog. And so that is a tractor with a mower on the back of it. We currently contract out some owners of tractors to help us with this. And so it's not the same process, unfortunately, as a bison or an elk. They're not being able to constantly eat the grass, constantly process that grass and digest it and then give it back to the soil. But we use this as a way to cut down sections of our grassland. So we're not always going to come through and bush hog a whole entire area. We're going to leave areas just like a herd of bison might not have come through and eaten the whole entire savanna. They might have only eaten a couple areas. So we're going to come through and do some rotational bush hogging in areas. And when do we do that? So we are going to, for us, since we are still restoring it, we don't have this beautiful mosaic of grasslands that Sean just spoke about. So we want to make sure that we are continuing to help restore populations of our turkeys and our bobwhite quails. So we wait to bush hog intentionally until after these birds have nested, and then also we want to continue to spread these plants, these grasses, these flowers, so we wait until they have already dropped their seed and have provided good food, a good food source for birds in the winter months. So we're going to wait to bush hog in the late winter months. Understory thinning. Why are we doing understory thinning? So here's a good example. This is our George Clark Conservation Easement. This is up in Gaston County. So, though I don't love the tree specimens here, that's a loblolly pine plantation. He has done a fantastic job, as I dropped that, a fantastic job of maintaining his understory. And this is the same conservation easement nearby, and this is not as much of a fantastic job. So he's doing a really good job of maintaining his crop. But he has opened up that forest floor, which is perfect for, I think he's a hunter, so it's perfect for his deer hunting, because he is actually providing nutrition and flowers and grasses for those deer. But so we are trying to mimic what unsuppressed fire would have done, coming through a landscape and burning down some of those trees that had just started to grow. We are trying to mimic what a buffalo or a elk would have done, coming through these areas and making sure that trees didn't grow up and knocking down the little saplings. So on the right is an example of an area that's sort of gone unmanaged. So in this process, we are trying to restore a managed understory. And I guess I should explain what an understory is. That is just anything that's not your canopy. So that could have your bushes, it could have your shrubs, it could have your ferns, it could have your grasses. So an unmanaged understory we have Lauren Rivera here, who deals with understory issues all the time in Mineral Springs, where she has an understory that was, until she got to deal with it, just inundated with autumn olive and privet and every non-native invasive you could think of. And so there was nothing growing beneath those. But we also have issues with understories that are full of natives, but they shouldn't be there. So we have these dry ridges that we're talking about, but then we have plants that should be growing by the creeks that are growing in the dry ridges. And that is because these plants, which we refer to as a mesic species of plant, that's going to be our beech trees and our maples and our hollies, have migrated upwards because they haven't seen fire. They haven't seen the big bison coming through and eating it. And so when we make these grasslands, these oak hickory savannas, these pine oak savannas, we want to make sure we have those pines and those oaks and those hickories. So these are all dry, fire tolerant trees that love to have their understory burned. All right, so how do we do this? How are we coming through and doing the understory burning? For the case for George Clark, he is coming through, and since that is a crop for him, he's going to be selectively clearing or thinning those trees. It's going to be mechanical, it's going to be with machines. But on a smaller scale, we might be able to do it with chainsaws. It's going to be pretty labor intensive. And we have been trying some new techniques and some smaller scale ones, which we're going to talk about our Jackson Blackjack Preserve down in Union County soon, where we're actually using a chemical mixed with an oil that penetrates the bark. It's called a basal bark treatment. So it's using a chemical and an oil, it penetrates the bark, gets into the tree, and it'll actually kill the tree. It allows the tree to continue to stand, provides shelter for bugs and birds, and then the next fire it sees, it'll be gone. But another good way to get to clear our understory is through burning. And this can be done any time of the year, except if we're doing those chemical treatments, there's going to be specific times that we do it. All right, this is where I can talk too much, so I'll try to keep it short. So prescribed fire, as Alicia mentioned, I have a passion for fire. We call ourselves, like, I'm pyrophilic. I'm not really like an arsonist. I'm more pyrophilic. I love fire. So why are we doing prescribed fire? When it comes for a management technique, it is very cost effective, it is more natural, and it's the most efficient thing that we can do to restore these grasslands. So one of the main reasons we're doing it is because we're going to be reducing the biomass. We're going to be recycling the nutrient-rich and the mineral-rich ash, which will go back into the soil and provide for our trees and our plants. It increases sunlight to the understory, so we're increasing our understory plants. It's increasing the travelability of those animals, as we saw in George Clark's loblolly plantation. Deer can actually get through it. They're not getting stuck in the beech trees and the maple trees. We're decreasing the amount of ticks. That sounds great, right? And we're decreasing the amount of disease-causing bugs. So one of the best ways to get rid of the southern pine beetle is to burn it. And it also increases the nut production. So we are increasing the reproduction of oaks and hickories and walnuts and all those trees that we like to see. We're also being able to accomplish two things at once. So not only are we being able to restore the grasslands, being able to open up that forest floor, we are mitigating future wildfire potential. So we're removing those heavy fuels that burn really hot and could cause issues in the future by doing these prescribed burns. Yeah?
So I have a quick question.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Andy, you talk about like the seed bank. Are you disrupting the seed bank?
No, the seed bank is in, so we are just burning the organic material on the top. So the seed bank is actually sort of in that mineral area that's not going to burn.
Love it.
So
Thank
yep. But we'll learn more that fire can be very complex. Mineral Springs is probably not a potential for burning because it's too close to homes. But so this is prescribed burning is one of the best ways to mitigate potential fire in the future. I love this map. So this is from a study in 2012 that was looking at what was the historical fire frequency. So how often were these areas burned back whenever fire was unsuppressed. So this was before the Europeans really settled. So this was back before the 1800s. So the indigenous people of the US who used fire as a way to produce everything that they produced. So we see on this map, Florida and Texas. They have the highest fire frequency. That landscape burned every 2 years. And why do we think that? Those two places have the most lightning. So yeah, Florida and Texas are the two top states for lightning strikes. And then we can see in the southeast, because of our grasslands, we also saw fire very frequently. Just like Florida, the majority of the time we see lightning, we see moisture. So we didn't really see large-scale unsuppressed fires because Mother Nature liked to rain. But in Texas is a different story. They had a really dry climate. A lot of times they would get dry lightning. So one of the things that is we've sort of been taught that lightning was the way natural fire came through our landscape. That is actually, it happened every once in a while, but it was actually the indigenous people of this area that maintained their area through fire. So they realized by using fire as a mechanism, they could make these grasslands, which was perfect for those grazing animals that they used, the bison and the elk and the deer. And then also it helped produce more nuts, which was a crop for them. So fire was definitely a part of this landscape for centuries, but that was due in millennia and everything, but that was due to the indigenous native people of the US. And as Sean and I mentioned, it was the Europeans that sort of disrupted that. And so as the Europeans came in, they didn't really understand why we were doing this. We're from Europe, it's very wet there, why are we burning things? And it became sort of there was a lot of issues going on when the Europeans first got there, but this was another issue for it. So prescribed burning really slowed down, and then in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was two really, really big fires. One in 1910 burned over 3 million acres up in Montana. And after that, which the US Forest Service had just been created in the early 1900s, they said, nope, we're not doing this anymore. They banned prescribed fire, and they banned all indigenous cultural fires. So from 1911, for the most of the 20th century, prescribed firing was banned. And so they didn't even let the wildfires burn. Usually, like right now, the policy is if a wildfire starts in a wilderness area, they are going to let it burn to a break. Not the case. If there was a fire anywhere in the US, the goal was to put it out by 10 a.m. the next morning. And it didn't matter how much manpower, how much money was spent, the fire was out. And so we had a really bad taste in our mouth for fire, and this individual made it worse. Smokey Bear. This was an advertisement in the 1940s and 50s. He was our advocate for stopping wildfire, and he really, everybody knows, only you can prevent forest fires. And so everybody was against forest fires. They needed to be suppressed, they needed to be stopped. And in the 1960s, we started realizing that we were calling just this detrimental issue to our landscape, to our forest, because we were not having these natural fires or these prescribed fires. So one of the first big things that was noticed was out in Yellowstone. The giant sequoias, they weren't reproducing because they needed fire. We started noticing that we had these plants and these birds and these insects that were just in massive decline. And so now the policy for the US Forest Service and most of us has changed, where we do want to use fire as a mechanism to support our landscape. Cool. So as I mentioned, fuel reduction is also a big deal. So when we weren't doing these prescribed burns or allowing these natural birds to come through, we were seeing loading and loading and loading of fuel. And so heavy fuels, big trees, hot fuels. And what happens when you do that is you have wildfires. So this is a wildfire I was on out in Utah in 2013. That was over 30,000 acres, and it was not fun. And we think that, in our head, we think that happens on the West Coast, that happens in those dry, arid areas, but it happens here too. So again, this is a picture of another picture of the car that's actually going to be in Utah as well. I just wanted to use an example of this. I watched this burn through somebody's neighborhood. It was one of the hardest things I've ever seen, to watch people lose their homes. And then on the left is actually South Mountains State Park in North Carolina. In 2016, we had a drought. We had wildfires starting. And the wildfires started in areas on the mountains that didn't have a prescribed burning program because it was too complex, it was too hard for the North Carolina Forest Service and the state parks to manage that. They have now changed how they think about it, and they're starting to implement better prescribed burning. But in 2016, if you guys were here, that smoke was in Charlotte. It was hard to breathe on days because that smoke was there. So how do we do it? How are we going to do a prescribed burn? And it's planning, it's so much planning, and there's more planning. So to be able to do it for the North Carolina State Parks, I took too many trainings. It took me about 5 years in total for them to finally be able to give me the match to say, you can do this. And so one of the first things we do is we submit a burn plan to the Forest Service, but that burn plan is gonna cover the objectives that we're trying to accomplish. So am I just looking to remove the fine fuels, which would be our grasses, and not burn up any of the trees? Or am I trying to just restore that forest and just burn every tree that's not fire adapted? Is gonna be how I build that fire plan and what I base our weather and everything off of. And then after I have come up with the idea of how do I want to do this, I start watching the weather. And so the burn season in North Carolina, and our driest time, if you guys didn't know, is the fall, and then late winter. So we usually have a burn season either times of those. A lot of times our wildfire season is in fall. But the best time to usually do a prescribed burn is in March, April, and May, May being the latest. And so we call some of those dormant season burns, and that's when the trees aren't growing yet. But if we are trying to get a really hot one and maybe kill some trees, we call that a growing season burn, and that would be in May. So you can see that I read what the National Weather Service puts out. It's a lot of numbers. It's not our pretty weather forecast that we see, but I'm paying attention to the temperature. I'm paying attention to the relative humidity, because if it's too high, things aren't going to burn. If it's too low, everything's going to burn. I'm paying attention to winds. So when we talk about grasslands, our fires are driven by winds. If I see that I'm going to have gusts of, that day I have gusts of 22, I don't think I can run faster than 22 miles per hour, so I don't want to start a fire that day. We see the inversion up there. The inversion is, if you guys have ever gone out in the morning when it's really cold and you see somebody has a wood stove on and the smoke is just sort of like a bubble above their house, that is because there is warmer air above the lower, or the ground air, so the smoke can't leave anywhere. So if you start a fire when there's an inversion, you're not going to be able to breathe. There's just a lot of things you have to pay attention to make sure you do it on the right day. And so I wanted to show you guys an example of how we did a burn earlier this year. So we did a burn up at Buffalo Creek Preserve in Cabarrus County. We called this area our Bloom Prairie, after Sean Bloom. It's a 10-acre field that went fallow, or it was unmanaged. It used to be a crop field, a failed crop field, and we started noticing some native grasses and plants in it, so we wanted to try to convert it back to fully native grasses. So we wanted to burn it. So that day I had a northwest wind, which was perfect because it was blowing all the smoke across our preserve, so it wouldn't affect anybody that was around. But when I say a northwest wind, that is not the way it is blowing, it's the way the wind is coming from. So if you ever see that in the forecast, it's always the way the wind is coming from. So if I'm standing there facing northwest, wind's in my hair. And so to do that, the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a fire break. So we want to use the area that would, so I said the fire would be wind driven. So to create the fire break, we are going to start the fire over here on Division C. And so that's going to slowly, it's not going to burn as quickly against the wind. It's going to slowly, we call it backing fire. So it's going to slowly, we have more bobwhite quail. It's going to slowly start creeping up this way. And so then we want to start closing it off. So we do it up here, it's called a flanking fire. And then when we really want to start having fun and doing what we're actually trying to accomplish, we do a head fire. And those are usually, that's the fire you're afraid of when it's a wildfire. That's the fire that sometimes you get stationed on when you're considered initial attack. So the wind is going to drive this fire, and by the time this backing fire is probably about 20 feet inside of this Division C line, we will set that head fire, and it'll start going, depending on how fast the wind is blowing. So if it was the day that I showed earlier, where it was a 22 mile per hour wind gust, it's going to go pretty fast. But again, we're going to pick the wind that's perfect. And so when we do these grassland fires, it's very fine fuels. They don't burn for too long. They only burn for a couple seconds to a couple minutes at most. And so we don't worry about, we hear Smokey always tells about embers. Embers come from those heavy trees, those big logs. And so with these grasslands, we don't have as much concern for starting other fires elsewhere. And so this fire took us about, Sharon, what do you think, 20 minutes?
Probably,
Yeah, it was very quick, burned 10 acres in 20 minutes. If I was trying to do another technique like this, it would have taken a really long time. And so here's an example of what the field looked like. Unfortunately, there's a lot of tall fescue. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But a lot of good broom sedge, which is very good at burning, very hot and flashy. This is it working its way through. That's a backing fire, so it's very low to the ground, creeping. This is by the end of it. So we pretty much scorched it. It looked good, and we had some happy people. So that is our Davidson Impact Fellow from last year, Raul Galvan, and one of our CTT community coordinators, Ashton, who enjoyed it. And you can see, and I brought some of my show and tell stuff, and you can see there in what we call Nomex. It is fire retardant clothing. It's very light. It's not what you would think a firefighter for the city of Charlotte would wear. So a lot lighter, easier to move in, a little bit more breathable. Awesome. Good. Next.
very much, Will. So we've talked about the history of our grasslands and how we manage our grasslands. I'm going to talk briefly about how we're implementing some of those management techniques to restore, create, or enhance grasslands here in the Charlotte area. And I'm going to start again at Buffalo Creek Preserve. On this map here, you can see the green star in the top corner. Buffalo Creek Preserve is located up in northeast Cabarrus County. Now this property here is a little bit of a story to it. This is about a 10-year project. In 2007, this property, about 400 acres, was originally slated to be a 500-home subdivision in Mount Pleasant. It's about 45 minutes outside of Charlotte. 2008 comes and the Great Recession hits. Not before they've already started to clear cut and clear cut the forest for the subdivision. They clear cut about 70 acres. When we received the property in 2011, this is what we were facing. And this is something that we had not dealt with before. We were used to mature hardwood forests. We were used to dealing with invasive species in those areas. We were not used to dealing with clear cuts like this. So we reached out to our partners, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to help us develop some management techniques. We recognized when we were out there, we've got a lot of these grassland plants and native grasses already growing out here. We've got the potential for a grassland habitat. There were trees, post oaks, southern red oaks, white ash, which are more commonly found in dry conditions in some of these pine oak savannas. The soil was very rocky and dry. And in addition, within about a 2-mile radius, there were 3 known populations of Schwanitz's sunflower. So we started to put these pieces together. This might be a good spot to try to restore grassland. And so what we did is we began with prescribed fire and drum chopping. So what drum chopping is, again, using a large tractor, you're going to get a giant drum. And we're talking about 10-foot diameter drum, bigger than I am. And on this drum are giant spikes. And what it does is you drag it across the ground and it grinds up all the logs and branches and breaks them up to try to make it a little bit easier to dry out and burn. Then we did 2 prescribed burns out here. This is what it looked like after the drum chopping and some of those initial prescribed burns. We still have way too much blackberry here and a lot of saplings of tulip poplars, maples, beeches, again, as well as pointing out, trees that are not traditionally found in grassland habitats. But tulip poplar especially is an early invading hardwood. You leave an area open and tulip poplar is going to come up pretty quickly. So we started to use some chemical treatments to target woody species. And in 2021, this is what it started to look like already. We've already got grasses coming back. We've got native wildflowers coming back. Not only that, the seed bank. We'll mention the seed. Actually, someone asked a question about the seed bank. In these grassland habitats, so what the seed bank is wildflowers, trees, they set out seed. Not every seed will germinate right away. And so they'll sit in the soil. And they'll get covered up by soil and leaf litter, and they'll just stay there in the soil until conditions are just right for them to germinate. And in our grasslands, many of our wildflowers actually require fire to germinate. Schwanitz's sunflower, the seeds will germinate, but if you expose it to fire ash, it increases its germination by 20%. So they actually need fire to grow. Shortleaf pine, those pine cones will not open unless they're exposed to heat. So we need fire for these seeds. So once we got fire out here, we had some plants start popping up. This is a slender golden top. It's a grassland species, most commonly found in the coastal plain, but here it shows up at Buffalo Creek Preserve. Slender mountain mint, again, another one of these open, sunny grassland plants. And the most surprising of all, in 2019, this little bitty pea was found by Laura Domingo, who's with Mecklenburg County Natural Resources. This is a state-protected plant. We did not know it was at Buffalo Creek, and it absolutely requires open grasslands. The fact that we had these plants coming up without introducing anything, just by returning fire, tells us that we were using the right management techniques in the right places. 10-year process of trying to restore this grassland. And I'm so thrilled that last fall, we got to plant 800 Schweinetz's sunflowers out there from 3 roadside populations. For those of you who don't know, Schweinetz's sunflower is a federally endangered plant. It's most often found around roadsides, which is really dangerous. In the wintertime, after snow, we like to salt our roads, which ruins the soil. They're susceptible to herbicide spray for roadside management, mowing to keep vegetation down along those roadsides, so they're in real danger along those roadsides. We worked with the North Carolina Botanical Garden to collect seed, and they grew them for us, brought them down last fall, and we planted them. This is the first protected site for this plant in Cabarrus County. So we're super excited by that. Building on that success, we decided where else can we do some of this grassland work? And we started the Power and Pollinators Project. We started in Pinhook Preserve, which is in Gaston County. The star there, kind of east central Gaston County. This was an easy one for us. It was about a 5-acre power line easement, power line utility. And we worked with Duke Energy to change the vegetation management there. For the longest time, we had a local landowner who helped manage the property for us and looked after it. In exchange, he cut hay off of it, and he actually had a food plot out there for deer. But the hay production, he was cutting hay off of it during the summer months, which is the worst time for grasslands. So we changed the management out there. Interesting thing, because we had a landowner who was cutting the grass, and it's about a mile down from a dirt road, and it's a short segment. Duke Energy didn't bother going down there. So it had not been exposed to herbicide applications. So in 2015, we stopped mowing. Now we only bush hog it in, again, February, March time period. The first year that we let it grow up, that seed bank was released, we had an explosion of swamp sunflower. Wow. And other wildflowers like spotted bee balm and tick seed and other sunflowers. And I'll tell you, spotted bee balm earns its name. This is a native wildflower, absolutely gorgeous. I put it in almost every slide because it's now my favorite plant. It's just got this absolutely gorgeous flower, and bees do absolutely love it. So now we're excited. We've got Buffalo Creek under our belt. We're doing a great job at Pinhook. Like, let's go bigger. So now we're looking at a 10-acre easement at Stanley Creek Forest. And this one we did partner directly with Duke Energy on how to manage that utility right away. And they also provided some financial support for it. And this is an interesting project because the utility easement runs along Old Highway 27. And so it's a route that a lot of road bikers use. It's kind of a scenic drive that cuts right through the middle of a 1,500-acre nature conservation area. And what we did is, again, we simply altered the management of that utility corridor. So we put up signs, no mow, no spray. So there's no herbicide applications taking place out here, and we're controlling when it gets mowed. Now at this site we did add some wildflower seed to it, a blend of native grasses and wildflowers, and it's doing terrific. Got a New England aster there. Milkweeds, lots of milkweed came up. Again, milkweed is so important because monarch caterpillars have to have milkweed to eat and grow and thrive. We're not happy with 5 acres, 10 acres. Now we're going really big. I'm going to let Will come up and talk about the newest addition to the Power and Pollinators Project.
Yeah, so like Sean said, go big or go home, right? So we wanted to expand the success we had at the Pinhook Preserve and at the Stanley Creek Preserve right-of-ways. So how can we do that? Let's get a lot bigger. So we recognized a corridor of Duke Energy easements parallel the Catawba River. They went through 2 of our conservation areas, including the Catawba Wildflower Glen and the Long Creek Conservation Area. They went through 2 Mecklenburg County natural resource preserves, the Iswa Nature Preserve and the Shuffletown Prairie. Duke Energy was on board, so we just went ahead with the 8.5-mile corridor. So let's look at the map real quick so we better understand it all. To the south, we have Iswa Nature Preserve. If you guys have never been there, it's a beautiful nature preserve on Lake Wiley, but we were focusing more on the utility easement that there's no trail to, but I don't know if you might be able to go off the trail and walk up to the utility easement. This corridor goes through the United States National Whitewater Center, and we also have conservation easements in that area. We call our Long Creek Conservation Area. It continues up north to our Catawba Wildflower Glen. That's our first project area for the Catawba Lands Conservancy that was purchased in 1995. And then over to the Shuffletown Prairie. So we chose this corridor because of several things. Duke was already managing Iswa, the Catawba Wildflower Glen, and Shuffletown Prairie in a better style because they were home to 3 special plants. So Shuffletown Prairie had that Schweinet sunflower that Sean speaks of, the federally endangered flower. Shuffletown Prairie also has a federally endangered smooth coneflower. So this is very special. It's the only area in the region where this is actually found. And then Iswa, our Catawba Wildflower Glen, and the Shuffletown Prairie all are home to a state endangered Georgia aster. So because of that, those 3 areas, Duke was already managing it differently. They weren't coming through as they normally would, broadcast spraying herbicide and killing everything. They were spot treating just the trees and the bushes that might cause issues in 30 or 40 years to their power lines. And also, they weren't bush hogging it in the summer, which tends to be the go-to time. If they ever needed to bush hog this area, they do it in the off-season, so back to that good March or April time frame. And so, because of that, they thought, let's just keep going. If there's these populations of the Schweinet sunflower, the aster, and the smooth coneflower, it might exist in other areas that we haven't noticed before. So we are now working to expand that whole project. Looking forward to working with the Whitewater Center, Charlotte Water, who owns a decent amount of parcels in that area, and hopefully local landowners here in the future. So it is a process. We hope it works. So I do want to talk about another property that we have. This is our Coley Preserve. It's up in Lincoln County. You can see the star up there in the top left corner. So this was a old hobby farm that we purchased back in 2016. And it was beautiful, but very poorly managed. So we went in dealing with some issues, but we knew that it had potential. We saw some native flowers, we saw native grasses. We knew that there was resident bobwhite quail, we knew there was resident turkeys, and the eastern meadowlark. And we'll talk more about the bird banding here in a second. So when we acquired this land, the fields that were there were mostly tall fescue. Tall fescue, for those that don't know what that is, that's your yard grass that we usually plant. It's a cool season grass. It's a sodding grass, but it's also a patchy grass. And so because of the way it sods and starts to come together, that's not good for our ground nesting birds. Quails can't make their way through it. They don't want to nest in it. Baby turkeys can't walk through it. So even if they can nest in it, it's not going to be good for them. It's also really not beneficial to any of our insects or our animals. And so we thought, how can we fix this? So back to the seed bank, we saw some good plants. So there was definitely good plants in that seed bank. So what we came through and we did was we broadcast treated with a broad spectrum chemical and killed all the tall fescue because there's not really any way else to get rid of it. So we needed to kill all the fescue, and within 1 year, so we treated it all in 2021, that whole entire field was mostly yellow crownbeard, which is about a 10-foot tall sunflower. So something was in there. And so we're happy with it, but there's still more for it to progress and to have a better component of grasses and flowers, so we're still working on it. And because it was poorly managed, not a lot of weed control, we have a lot of invasive plants there. So we were dealing with a grass called Johnson grass that's pretty hardy and hard to deal with. Lynn's getting some nightmares right now. And this year, we chose to tackle, so there's an invasive plant that's biennial, so it comes up every 2 years. We didn't see it in 2021, but we sure saw it in 2022, and that is thistle. So not our native thistle, our non-native thistle, so we had a team go out and work too hard to try to get rid of thistle, which is not a fun plant to work with. So we're still progressing, trying to take old crop fields and convert them back into native grasses. So we were lucky enough that somebody reached out to us in Lincoln County. His name is Keith, and he wanted to do some more bird research there. So he's a bird bander, and we mentioned that we're in the process of restoring this. There's going to be a lot of changes. We're going to be disturbing this frequently. And he reached out to the researchers he does studies with, and they said, that's great. Let's see how the bird diversity will change as the fields change. So he set up his mist nets. Here's an example of a female indigo bunting. I know you just talked about, you saw an indigo bunting. So for those that aren't familiar with indigo buntings, females not that beautiful, the males, beautiful indigo. So he was able to catch some indigo bunting and some other very special birds. And this year, while thistle treating, Sharon was able to find a turkey egg. So we know that they're using our fields now for laying eggs, and in the past we have found quail eggs as well. So on to one of our favorite ones, Jackson Blackjack. It's one of Sean's favorites, so we'll let him talk.
So this site here is really exciting. Jackson Blackjack is located in southwest Waxhaw, or southwest Union County in Waxhaw. It's home to what's called a xeric hardpan forest. A lot of words there. Xeric refers to dry. So this is an extremely dry site. Hardpan, that's referring to the soil type. This is an elastic clay soil, sometimes called a shrink-swell soil. So what happens is when it rains and gets wet, it quickly swells, and water cannot get through it. Then as it dries, it shrinks back down. And so it does not hold moisture very well. That shrinking attribute means it doesn't hold roots very well. So you end up with these stunted trees, and only trees that are very well tolerant of these types of soils, primarily blackjack oaks, post oaks, and Maryland oaks. This is probably one of our more ambitious restoration efforts now. Because of fire suppression, the canopy is closed, but there are still some grassland wildflowers trying to pop up in a few pockets out there. Also, the western boundary of this property is Potter Road, and along that roadside, we have a lot of these grassland plants that absolutely need full sun conditions. Wildflowers like barber's buttons, liatris or blazing star, and leopard's bane, which by the way is doing a terrific job in keeping the leopards away. And again, a population of birdfoot trefoil. We were out there this past fall and counted over 6,000 stems along Potter's Road. And about 1,500 feet down the road is a population of Schweinetz's sunflowers. So what we are really hoping here is that as we restore the woodland grassland at Jackson Blackjack, we're expecting and hoping that some of these roadside plants are in that seed bank. And as we open up the canopy and get more sunlight down to the forest floor, we'll get to see some of these starting to pop back up. So these are some of the trees I was mentioning. As you can see, it's still pretty well stocked with trees. Those trees are probably no more than 50 feet tall, 50, maybe 60 feet tall, where most of our oak trees can tower up to about 100 feet tall. And one other interesting thing about Jackson Blackjack is it's home to a population of fox squirrels. And if you're not familiar with these are very large squirrels. When I first saw it, I thought it was a cat. This is the black form, and we actually have the black form of the fox squirrel out there. So this is probably the westernmost range for the fox squirrel. They're much more common in the coastal plain and sandhills of the Carolinas. But we could not do all of this work ourselves. We absolutely have to rely on our partners as well. So we're thankful to Mecklenburg County Natural Resources. We partner with them on conserving the Gar Creek Conservation Area. up at McCoy Road up near Huntersville. It's home to Schwanitz's Sunflowers, and Mecklenburg County has a terrific burn program. They're probably one of the pioneers of grassland habitat management and conversion in the Southeast. We also work with the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program on the Adam Hunter Prairie at Red Lair, which is in the 1,500-acre Spencer Mountain Conservation Area. And we're also working with Union County Parks and Rec at Cane Creek, which is down, again, near Waxhaw. They've got a 5-acre protected site for Schwanitz's sunflower, and we were actually out there last year helping them manage sweet gums that are beginning to invade their prairie. And we're trying to work with them on developing a bird program out there as well. Through this partnership, we do work with our partners and assist with prescribed burns. We've assisted quite a number of prescribed burns at Adam Hunter Prairie, and we also do counts of Schwanitz's sunflowers and Georgia asters. This is a team that was out there, and this past fall, we counted over 2,500 flowering stems of Schwanitz's sunflower at the Adam Hunter Prairie over near Spencer Mountain. So you talk about big projects, but these can also be small. The Catawba Grasslands Project includes what we call pocket prairies. And this is something you can do at home. So we have a couple trails that we manage with trailheads. And a couple summers ago, we were out there, middle of July, mowing grass again. It's hot and we're tired of mowing grass. And we think to ourselves, why as a conservation organization are we mowing grass twice a month through the summer? And so we decide we're going to kill the fescue grass and bring in native wildflowers. And we tried that first at Seven Oaks down in Belmont. So this is what it looked like before. It's nice and lush green grass. We got rid of the grass there. And with volunteers, we planted plugs of native wildflowers and native grasses, and then mulched over that. This is what it looked like that summer. Wow. An explosion of black-eyed Susans and purple cone flowers. Now, I will say some lessons were learned here. This looks phenomenal, and I love using this photo. But the collection of plants that we used had a very narrow flowering period. So it looked terrific from about the end of April until maybe mid-June, maybe mid-July. And after that, they set seed, and there was nothing else to come up behind it.
Yeah.
And so we're working to try to add additional wildflowers and extend that bloom range so it goes from March until October. But with that lesson learned, we then moved up the road to the South Fork Trail up in McAdenville. And there, after removing the grass, we still planted some plugs of wildflowers so we would get an initial burst of flowering plants. But we also relied more on a seed blend so that we had a much more diverse palette of wildflowers. At Seven Oaks, I think we had maybe 10 wildflowers. Here, it's a palette of about 20, including some grasses. And you need those grasses, let me mention. If you're going to do a pocket prairies like this, you absolutely need to plant native grasses as well. That's what helps to support those long stems on those purple cone flowers. It's also what some of our native bees are going to lay eggs in during the wintertime. I'll just point out this photo here on the bottom left. That's a pocket prairie that I've got at my home. That's my home garden there. So these can look beautiful even in a home setting. So that's something that you can do today. And actually right now is the perfect time. Because if you get the grass out and put the seed out right now, many of our native seeds actually need to have what's called cold stratification. They have to have a period of cold, wet weather before they'll germinate. So if you put the seed out right now, just before wintertime, it's going to get 2 or 3 months of cold, wet weather, and they'll germinate, and you'll start having wildflowers by next spring. But if you want to do even more, you can support the Catawba Grasslands Project with your donations. And you can see how we can use your donations to enhance and further these efforts of the Catawba Grasslands Project. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I appreciate everything, and I'm Will and I are both here, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.